The word hit Dorothy Wainwright like a slap before she had even tied her horse to the post. Whore. It was not whispered. It was not muttered behind a hand. It was said cleanly, deliberately, by a woman in a yellow bonnet standing on the boardwalk of Harlan's Creek, Nevada, in the autumn of 1882, said loud enough for the three women flanking her to hear it clearly, and loud enough for Dorothy to feel it land in her sternum like a thrown stone. Dorothy did not flinch. That was the first thing anyone watching would have noticed. She had traveled 640 miles by rail and another 31 by horse across cracked alkaline flats to reach this town, and she had survived worse than a bonnet and a sharp tongue. She let her dark eyes settle on the woman with the kind of slow, deliberate patience that made people deeply uncomfortable, and she said nothing at all. "We know why you are here," the woman continued. Her name, Dorothy would learn later, was Vera Clanton, wife of the largest landowner in the valley, and she had the particular confidence of a person who had never once been told she was wrong. "We know your history. We know what you did in Sacramento. And we have already decided that Harlan's Creek has no use for a woman like you." Dorothy reached into her saddlebag, pulled out a folded letter, and without a word handed it to the town's postmaster, who happened to be standing 6 feet away with his mouth open like a man watching a thunderstorm blow in from the west. Then she untied her horse, led him to the water trough at the edge of the street, and let him drink. The letter was from the Nevada Territorial Survey Office. It appointed Dorothy Wainwright, formerly of Sacramento and before that of Philadelphia, as the licensed land surveyor assigned to settle the boundary dispute that had been quietly strangling Harlan's Creek for 3 years. Without her work, no deed in the valley could be legally recorded. Without her work, the railroad contract that everyone in town desperately needed would never be signed. She knew this. Vera Clanton did not know this yet. That gap between what Dorothy knew and what the town did not yet understand was the only armor she needed. She had arrived in a town that had already decided about her. But there had been a meeting 5 days earlier in the back room of the Harlan's Creek saloon, where the mayor and the sheriff and the 3 largest ranchers had gathered to discuss the boundary dispute with rising panic, and one cowboy had not been at that meeting. His name was Grant Wells, and the reason he had not attended was that he had been 40 miles north, alone in a canyon with a lame horse and a broken compass, trying to find the southern fence line of the Wells Range, and failing, because without a proper survey, the land itself refused to give up its secrets. Grant Wells rode into Harlan's Creek 3 hours after Dorothy did. He came in from the north, which meant he did not pass the cluster of women on the boardwalk. He did not hear the word that had been aimed at Dorothy like a bullet. He came in covered in red dust, his dark brown hat pushed back on his head, his jaw carrying 3 days of dark stubble, leading his horse by the reins because the animal was still favoring its left foreleg. He was 31 years old, 6 feet and 2 inches tall, and he had the kind of face that looked like the land itself had carved it, all strong lines and weathered patience. He tied his horse at the livery, spoke briefly to the young man inside about the leg, handed over $2 he could not really spare, and then walked directly to the hotel, where he intended to wash the canyon out of his hair and eat something that was not hardtack. The woman at the hotel desk told him the last available room had just been given to a Miss Wainwright, and Grant nodded, asked if there was a cot available anywhere, and was told there was not. He stood in the lobby for a moment, hat in hand, thinking through his options, when the staircase creaked and Dorothy Wainwright came down it carrying a rolled leather tube of survey instruments and looking like a woman with somewhere very important to be. They saw each other in the same moment. She was 27 years old. She wore a practical dark wool traveling dress that had seen serious use, good boots that were resoled and re-resoled, and her brown hair was pinned up in the efficient manner of a woman who had no patience for anything that required more than 2 minutes of effort. Her eyes were the color of strong coffee, and they assessed Grant Wells in the time it took him to register that she was the most unexpectedly striking person he had seen in 6 months. "You are blocking the door," she said. He stepped aside. "My apologies, ma'am." She walked past him without slowing down. The leather tube bumped his elbow as she went by, and the contact was so brief and accidental that it should not have registered at all. And yet Grant stood in the hotel lobby for a full 3 seconds after she had gone, staring at the door she had walked through. The hotel clerk cleared his throat. "That's the surveyor," the clerk said, with the tone of a man conveying both information and personal opinion simultaneously. "Is it?" Grant said. "Town's been talking about nothing else since she rode in this morning. Vera Clanton called her a—" "I do not need to know what Vera Clanton called her," Grant said. He got a room that night from a rancher named Peterson who owed him a favor. A small room above the feed store with a window that looked out over the main street. And he lay on the narrow bed in the dark listening to the Nevada wind coming off the flats, thinking about a woman who had walked past him like he was furniture, and had eyes like dark water, and carried herself like someone who had been carrying herself alone for a very long time. Dorothy, meanwhile, had gone directly to the land registry office, which was kept by an elderly man named Mr. Abbott, who had been the town's secretary since before it was properly a town. She spent 3 hours in his back room going through deeds, original land grants, old survey stakes, and the competing claims that had created the boundary dispute. She took meticulous notes in a small leather journal. She did not eat dinner until 9 in the evening, when the restaurant was nearly empty, and she sat alone at a corner table and ate her pork and beans and read through her notes while the candle burned low. 3 men watched her from across the room. She was aware of this. She ate every bite of her meal. The next morning, Dorothy was in the field by 5 o'clock. She had borrowed a mule from the livery, a solidly built gray animal named by his owner as Trouble, which she found both appropriate and amusing. She carried with her a girly transit, a Jacob's staff, a measuring chain, a hand level, and her notebook. The girly transit was a precision theodolite-style instrument manufactured in Troy, New York, and it was the best piece of surveying equipment west of Denver. She had saved for it for 4 years. She treated it with more consistent care than she had ever treated anything else in her life. The land outside Harlan's Creek was beautiful in the early morning in the way that truly difficult terrain often is. The valley floor was flat and hard and silvery with alkali, but the edges rose into red rock formations that caught the first light and held it like burning coal. The boundary dispute covered approximately 40,000 acres, touching the properties of 3 different ranchers, the town commons, and a stretch of land claimed by the railroad but not yet proved under the terms of the Pacific Railroad Act. Dorothy set up her first transit station on a limestone outcropping that she had identified from the old maps as the probable location of the original 1865 survey point. She leveled the instrument with the meticulous care of someone who understood that every measurement she took today would either stand up in a federal court or would not, and there was no middle position. She was reading her first angle when she heard hoofbeats. Grant Wells pulled his horse up 20 yards away and sat in the saddle looking at her and her equipment and the careful order of her work site with an expression that she could feel on her skin even without turning around. "This is Wells' land," he said, not aggressively, more in the manner of a man establishing a fact so that facts might be discussed from there. "Not yet it is not," Dorothy said, still looking through the transit. "That is the point of the exercise. Please do not move anything." Grant dismounted. He tied his horse to a scrub pine and came closer, which she noted, and stopped when he was close enough to see what she was doing but far enough to be respecting the request not to disturb anything that she also noted. "You are the surveyor," he said. "Dorothy Wainwright, yes." "Grant Wells. My family's ranch is north of here about 4 miles. "I know. I have read every land claim in the county. Your grandfather's original patent, your father's 1871 extension, And the competing claim filed by Amos Ridley in 1878 that says your southern fence line is 300 yards over the actual boundary. There was a silence. She heard him absorb this. Ridley says we stole his grazing land, Grant said. We did not steal anything. That may well be true. The problem is that the original survey was done by a man named Cartwright in 1865, who was later found to have been using a defective compass and made systematic errors across his entire career. Every boundary he staked in this county is in question. That is why I am here. She finished her reading, made her notation, and then turned to look at him directly for the first time since he had ridden up. The morning sun was behind her and it put full light on his face, and she saw something there that she had not expected, which was not suspicion or resentment but a genuine and somewhat hungry curiosity. "How does it work?" he said, nodding at the girly transit. Dorothy looked at him for a moment, measuring something that was not land. "You actually want to know? I would not have asked if I did not want to know." She walked him through it, briefly but without talking down to him, explaining the principles of triangulation, of measuring horizontal angles between known points, of how she could calculate positions of extraordinary precision using mathematics and a carefully leveled line of sight. Grant listened with the focused attention of a man who spent his life reading terrain and weather, and understood that the world rewarded precise observation. "So you can tell exactly where the line is," he said. "Down to the foot, down to within a margin that no court will dispute, yes. And if Ridley is wrong, then he is wrong and the record will show it in terms he cannot argue with." Grant looked at her with the direct, uncomplicated respect of a man who appreciated competence without any of the confusion that some men felt when that competence belonged to a woman. "How long will it take? If I'm not interfered with, 10 days, perhaps 12. The word interfered sat between them, carrying a weight they both understood referred to more than equipment and transit stations. "I heard what Vera Clanton said to you yesterday," Grant said quietly. Dorothy's chin came up half an inch. "I imagine the whole street heard it. I was not there. I only heard about it last night. I want you to know that it does not represent every opinion in this town." "It represents enough of them," she said. "It was not self-pity. It was information stated plainly." "What did you do in Sacramento?" he said, and then immediately, "You do not have to answer that." She looked out over the valley. The alkali flats shimmered in the growing morning light. "I worked for a firm there. The head of that firm decided that the contracts I had secured, the clients I had brought in, and the reputation I had built would be more valuable to him if my name was not attached to them. When I objected, he told his wife that I had been his mistress. His wife told her friends. Her friends told the county. I left because there was nothing left to stay for." The silence that followed was the kind that has weight and temperature. "That is a vicious thing to do to someone," Grant said. "Yes," Dorothy said, "it is." She looked back at him. "Most people hear that story and wonder what I did to provoke it. I did not wonder that." She studied him again with those dark coffee eyes. "No," she said slowly, "I do not think you did." She turned back to her instruments. He stood for another moment, then went back to his horse, and she heard him ride north. She let out a breath she had not fully realized she was holding, and then she went back to work, because work was the only language the land understood, and the land did not care about Sacramento. The days that followed established a rhythm that Dorothy had not expected and Grant had not planned for. He began appearing at her work sites. Not every day, and not in a way that suggested he was following her, but in the way that a man who is working his own land and watching its boundaries being carefully measured finds himself nearby with some regularity. He never interrupted her work. He would tie his horse, sometimes settle on a rock or a fence rail, and watch. When she needed something moved, he moved it. When she had readings to call out to herself for notation, he began, after the third day, to offer to hold the rod or the chain without her asking, and she found that he was good at it, that he stayed perfectly still when stillness was required and moved efficiently when movement was needed. On the fourth day, they ate lunch together by a creek bed that was nearly dry. She had hard cheese and dried apples. He had cornbread wrapped in a cloth and cold coffee in a tin canteen. They traded without discussion. "You went to school for this," he said. It was not quite a question. "Philadelphia College of Science. I was one of 2 women in the engineering program." There was a great deal of discussion about whether we should be admitted. The discussion was resolved in our favor because the man who endowed the building had a daughter who wanted to study chemistry, and he told the Board of Governors that if she was not admitted, he would take his name off the building. She said it without bitterness, just the facts of the world as it was. I do not think they would have let us in otherwise. "You were good at it," Grant said. "I was the best in my class." She said this in the same tone she would have used to say it was going to rain, and he found himself smiling at the absolute lack of apology in it. "My mother could read a storm 3 days out," he said. "Better than any weatherman I ever heard of. She said my father married her because she saved his entire wheat crop in 1856 by calling a hailstorm that everyone else thought was clear weather. He pulled the wheat in 24 hours early because she told him to. He said afterward that any woman who could read the sky like that was a woman worth keeping close." Dorothy looked at him over her apple. "Your father sounds like a man of sense." "He had his moments." Grant's voice shifted slightly. "He passed 4 years ago. Influenza. I am sorry. My mother the year before. She did not want to go first, but she went first, and he did not last long after. Some people are like that." Dorothy looked at the dry creek bed. "I understand that kind of attachment," she said quietly. "In theory, I have not had the personal experience of it. You are only 27. How do you know my age?" "Mr. Abbott," he said. "He mentions you quite freely." She made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but was in the neighborhood. "Mr. Abbott is the most efficient gossip in the territory." "He likes you," Grant said. "He told me you work harder than any surveyor he has seen, and he has seen 4. He also told me you corrected his filing system on your 2nd day, and he has been finding things twice as fast ever since. His filing system was organized by size of document, which is one of the least useful organizational principles I have encountered." He did not seem offended. He seemed relieved, she agreed. They were quiet together for a while. The creek made no sound because it had no water, but the cottonwoods along its banks stirred in a light breeze, and that made a sound that was close enough. "Why surveying?" Grant asked. Dorothy thought about it seriously, which he could see her doing, the way her eyes went slightly distant and her hands stilled in her lap. "Because land is the argument that never ends in this country," she said. "Every war, every injustice, every broken promise made to the people who were here before us, every homesteader ruined and every fortune built, it all comes down to a line drawn in the earth. Who draws that line and how accurately they draw it determines the shape of people's lives. I wanted to be the person who draws it correctly." Grant looked at her for a long moment. The breeze moved a strand of hair across her cheek. She tucked it back behind her ear with a practical, unself-conscious gesture. "That is the best reason for doing any kind of work that I have ever heard," he said. Dorothy Wainwright, who had been told by the head of a land surveying firm in Sacramento that her opinions on the philosophical implications of her profession were an embarrassment, looked at Grant Wells and felt something shift in the architecture of her chest, like a door she had not known was closed opening just slightly on its hinges. She said nothing about this. She picked up her notebook and went back to work. On the 5th day, the trouble arrived. It came in the form of Amos Ridley, who was 63 years old, rangy as old wire fence, and who had the particular quality of a man who had spent his entire adult life believing he was owed something by the world, and was perpetually furious that the world had not delivered. He rode up to Dorothy's work site with 2 of his hired men, and his face was already arranged in the expression of someone who has come to a conversation having predecided its outcome. "You stop right there," he said, while his horse was still moving. Dorothy did not stop. She was in the middle of a backsite reading and she completed it, wrote it down, and then raised her head. "Mr. Ridley." "You have been surveying Wells' land without my permission," Ridley said. I am surveying the disputed boundary under the authority of the Nevada Territorial Survey Office, Dorothy said. I do not require your permission. I have a territorial warrant. She produced the document from her coat pocket with the ease of someone who had anticipated this conversation and prepared for it. You are welcome to examine it. Ridley did not take the document. He looked at it as if it might bite him, which suggested he could not read it, or was afraid of what he might have to acknowledge if he did. His two hired men said nothing, but they moved their horses in a way that was meant to be subtly threatening. My boys say you've been spending a lot of time up here with Grant Wells, Ridley said, and the way he said it made the implication unmistakable and ugly. Grant Wells has provided occasional assistance with the survey equipment, Dorothy said, with the flat clarity of someone who has no intention of being deflected by insinuation. As have two of your own neighbors on days when they happen to be passing. If you object to the survey being conducted, you are welcome to raise that objection with the territorial office in Carson City. I have their address if you require it. Ridley's jaw tightened. He was not used to women who answered him this way. I have friends in Carson City, he said. So do I, Dorothy said. They appointed me to this position. The standoff held for a moment that was brittle with the particular tension of a man who has ridden up expecting to intimidate and has encountered instead a person who cannot be intimidated. Then Grant Wells crested the ridge above them. He had not been expected. He rode down at a steady pace that communicated absolutely no urgency, which is the most effective way to communicate that one is not frightened. He stopped his horse between Dorothy's work site and Ridley's men. Amos, he said, in a tone of voice that was perfectly civil and held nothing friendly in it at all. Wells, Ridley said, Miss Wainwright is doing her work. The territorial warrant is legitimate. I have read it. He had, in fact, read it at Dorothy's invitation on the second day, when she had explained the scope and legal basis of her assignment. Is there something you need from this site, or are you riding somewhere else? The calculus in Ridley's eyes was visible. Grant Wells was 31 years old and ranged across 40,000 acres and had his father's reputation and his own in this valley, and he was not a man who could be pushed around without significant cost. This is not over, Ridley said, which was both a threat and a retreat. I assume not, Grant said. Safe ride home. Ridley turned his horse and his hired men turned with him and they rode back toward the eastern edge of the valley. Grant watched them go until they were small in the distance, then looked at Dorothy. How long has he been doing things like that? Grant asked. Since the second morning, she said, and the admission of it, the calm, unaffected way she delivered it, told him it had been happening more often than just today. He came by the hotel the first night to speak with the owner about whether my continued presence was appropriate. Grant's expression shifted into something controlled and unhappy. And the hotel owner, to his credit, told Ridley that his guest's business was their own and showed him the door. But Mr. Ridley has been coming around my work sites every other day with one variation or another. He knocked over one of my transit station stakes last Thursday. I reset it. You should have told me, Grant said. She looked at him with the expression of a woman who has heard those words before and found them previously unreliable. Should I have? He understood the weight in those 3 words. He held her gaze. I am not saying you cannot handle it yourself. I am saying that you should not have to handle it by yourself. Those are different things. Dorothy looked at him for a long, careful moment. The wind came off the flats and moved the alkali dust in small spirals across the ground. They are different, she agreed at length. I apologize. The distinction is one I am not accustomed to. I know, he said. I think you have been on your own for long enough that the idea of having someone on your side feels more like a risk than a relief. Her chin came up slightly, not in defensiveness. More in surprise, the way a person looks when something true is said about them unexpectedly. She went back to her instruments. But that afternoon, when she was packing up her equipment to ride back to town, she said without looking at him, "Will you be in this part of the valley tomorrow?" I expect I will, he said. Then I expect I will see you, she said, and rode down toward the creek crossing without looking back. He watched her go. He was in serious trouble and he knew it, and the knowledge sat in his chest like a lantern that someone had just lit. The seventh day brought rain, which was rare enough in the Nevada Valley in October that the whole town seemed briefly confused by it. Dorothy worked in the rain because surveys do not wait for weather, and because she was on a schedule that the territorial office had agreed to, and she had no intention of being late. She wore a canvas duster over her wool dress and a wide-brimmed hat that she had bought the previous spring specifically for working in wet conditions, and she measured angles through the rain with a patience that made the rain feel irrelevant. Grant found her at noon standing knee-deep in what had been a dry wash that morning, and was now running 3 inches of fast, red-brown water. She was holding her notebook above her head with one hand and her transit case with the other, and was making her steady way across. The mule was already on the far bank, having crossed without her, because trouble had the self-interested practicality of all mules. Grant dismounted at the bank and waded in without removing his boots because there was no time for that, and took the transit case from her hand before she could object. "I have it," she said. "I know you do. Now I have it, and you have both hands free for the crossing." She looked at him steadily, water running off the brim of her hat. Then she took both hands to steady herself on the rocky bottom of the wash and crossed the rest of the way without event. He crossed beside her, one hand holding the transit case above the water, one hand available but not presumptuous. They stood on the bank dripping. The rain came down steadily and turned the valley silver gray. "Thank you," she said. "The case would have been ruined," he said. "I know. I was calculating the risk. And I had decided to risk it rather than not get across." She took the case back from him carefully. "I had 3 more stations to read before the light goes." "You will not make 3 more before the light goes," he said. "I will make 2, she said. She made all 3. Grant rode back to town with her as the light failed because he happened to be heading in the same direction, which was the manner in which he increasingly arranged his days. They rode in the dark of early evening with the rain thinning to mist and the town's few lights appearing ahead like low, warm stars. "Tell me about Philadelphia," he said. She glanced at him. "What aspect of it?" "Whatever you miss." She thought about it with the same seriousness she gave everything. "The library," she said. "There is a library on Locust Street with a reading room that has windows 20 feet high and books on every subject that exists. I used to go there on Saturdays. I would stay until they threw me out." A brief pause, the smell of it, old paper and lamp oil and possibility. "We have a lending library in the county seat," he said. "It has approximately 40 books. I know, I have read 12 of them already. Mr. Abbott has a lending arrangement." He smiled in the dark. "And what do you miss about it specifically that is not a book?" She was quiet for a moment. "The anonymity," she said, finally. "In a city that size, you can be unknown. No one has decided about you in advance. Every day you meet people who have no opinion formed about you yet." She paused. "I understand that it is also lonely in that way. I am not arguing that city life is superior. I am only answering what you asked. And what do you not miss about it?" "The men who run everything," she said, with a precision that carried old fury behind it very efficiently. "The particular way they smile when you show them work that is better than their own. The way they take the smile back when they realize it was not a performance." Grant said nothing for a moment. Then, "There is a man in Sacramento who ought to be very uncomfortable right now." "He is comfortable as a cat," Dorothy said. "He is always comfortable. That is the injustice of it." "The injustice of it," Grant repeated. "Yes, that is what it is." She looked at him sideways in the mist and the dark. "You understand that this is not a sentiment that every man would express." "I understand it is not a sentiment that most men I know would express. I cannot speak to every man." He looked straight ahead at the lights of the town. "My mother was the smartest person in our family. Everyone knew it and my father said it openly and often. I grew up understanding that intelligence is not a gender. It is a fact that some people have and some do not, and you are lucky to know the ones who do regardless of who they are. Dorothy was quiet for the rest of the ride into town. At the livery, she handed Trouble off to the stable hand and began to gather her equipment. Grant took the two heaviest cases without asking. She did not take them back. They walked together to the hotel in the Nevada mist, and at the door she turned to face him. "Grant," she said, using his given name for the first time. Something happened to his expression that he did not manage in time to prevent. It was very brief, but she saw it, the involuntary shift of a man who has been trying to be careful and has just heard the one thing that makes careful very difficult. "Thank you for today," she said, "for the crossing and for Ridley and for the company." "I did not do anything," he said. "You did several things," she said. "Good night." She took her equipment cases from him, both of them, and went inside. He stood on the boardwalk in the mist long enough that the stable boy walking past gave him a curious look, and then he turned and walked back to the feed store in the dark. On the 9th day, Dorothy found the error. It was not Cartwright's error, though she had been finding those all week in systematic and documented abundance. This error was new. Someone had moved one of her transit stakes. Not knocked it over as Ridley's man had done before, but moved it, deliberately and with apparent knowledge of what the movement would mean for her calculations. The stake had been relocated approximately 9 feet to the northwest of its original position, which would, if she had taken her readings from the new location without realizing the change, have produced a false boundary line that added 312 acres to Ridley's property and removed them from the well's range. Dorothy stood and looked at the moved stake for a long time. She went back to her notes, confirmed the original position from the triangulated measurements she had taken earlier in the week, documented everything with the precise care of a person who knows they are building a legal record, and then reset the stake in its correct location. She did not tell Grant immediately. She told him that evening in the small dining room of the hotel, over a supper she had invited him to because she had things to say that needed to be said face to face. "Someone attempted to falsify the survey," she said, over the pot of beans. She told him what she had found and what it would have meant for his land. Grant's face went through several things in a short time and settled on something very controlled and very cold. "Ridley," he said. "Almost certainly, though proving it is another matter. The stake manipulation itself proves nothing except that someone moved a stake. What it does do is establish that someone in this valley understands the survey well enough to know which stake to move and why." She looked at him steadily. "It also means I need to accelerate. If they move the wrong stake at the wrong moment, it could compromise the whole survey and I would have to start sections over." "How much more time do you need?" 3 days, possibly 2 if the weather holds." He nodded. He looked at the table for a moment, then at her. "Dorothy, I need to say something." "Say it." "I have been thinking for the past several days about how to say what I want to say without making you feel like it is an obligation, or a complication, or another thing you have to manage. I have not come up with a satisfactory approach, so I am going to abandon the attempt and simply say it." She waited, perfectly still. "I am falling in love with you," Grant said. He said it with the directness of a man who has looked at a difficult fence line for long enough and decided the only way to deal with it is to ride straight at it. "I know that you came here to do a job, and I know that you have had your trust burned by people who were not worthy of it, and I know that the last thing you may want is another complication in a place that has already been unkind to you. But I would rather say it and be wrong about the reception than not say it and spend the rest of my life wondering." The silence that followed was extraordinary. The dining room had 3 other people in it, and all of them had developed a sudden and intense interest in their plates. Dorothy looked at Grant Wells across the table. She looked at his face, which was honest and open and afraid in the way that only brave people look afraid, because only brave people tell the truth when the truth is frightening. "I am going to finish the survey," she said. His expression held very carefully still. "And when it is done," she continued, "and the boundary is legally recorded and Ridley's false claim is settled, and the railroad contract is secured, I would like to have a conversation with you about whether there is something here worth pursuing." She paused. "I say this because I do not make impulsive decisions. I say it also because the reason I do not make impulsive decisions is that I am very aware that what I am feeling at this particular moment is making it difficult to be as careful as I usually am." The careful stillness of his expression broke entirely. It broke into something warm and helpless and genuine, and it was possibly the most attractive thing Dorothy Wainwright had ever seen on a human face. "3 days," he said. "Possibly 2, she said. It was 2. On the 11th morning, Dorothy completed her final readings, closed her field notebook for the last time, and carried her girly transit back to town in its case, strapped to Trouble's flank. She went to Mr. Abbott's registry office and spent 4 hours completing the official survey document, checking every calculation 3 times, and producing the legal plat that would be filed with the territorial office in Carson City. The results were clear and unambiguous, and left no room for argument that any court would entertain. The Wells Range southern boundary fell exactly where the Wells family had maintained it fell. Grant's grandfather had fenced correctly in 1862. Amos Ridley's 1878 claim was built entirely on Cartwright's defective original survey, and the corrected mathematics placed the true boundary 311 yards east of where Ridley had claimed. Ridley had not 300 acres of stolen grazing land. He had 0. The town was informed through Mr. Abbott, who performed this function with visible and barely concealed delight. Dorothy delivered the plat to the territorial office representative, a man named Collins who had ridden in from Carson City specifically for this purpose, in the presence of Mayor Hendricks, Sheriff Dolan, and the railroad company representative, who had been waiting in the town hotel for 11 days and was visibly relieved. The railroad contract was signed 2 hours later. It would bring a spur line through the valley, a station, a market for beef and grain, and prosperity of a kind that Harlan's Creek had not yet seen. Every landholder in the valley would benefit, including Amos Ridley, who had done everything in his power to prevent the survey being completed, and who would profit anyway, which was the particular frustrating justice of the frontier. Grant stood at the back of the room when the contract was signed. He caught Dorothy's eye across the heads of the assembled mayor and ranchers and railroad men, and the look they exchanged contained more than words, though neither of them said anything at all. Afterward, the crowd in the office thinned out into the street, and people stood in the autumn sun talking about the railroad and the future, and which side of the track the station would be on. Dorothy packed the last of her documentation into her leather satchel. Grant was beside her before she had finished, not having announced his approach just there. "Miss Wainwright," he said formally because they were in public. "Mr. Wells," she said with the ghost of a smile, "I believe you mentioned a conversation that would be available after the survey was completed. I did mention that. It is completed. It is. Would you do me the honor of riding out to the north end of the valley with me this afternoon?" He paused. "I want to show you something." She looked at him. "What?" "Something I think you will find interesting." She considered this. "I have an appointment with Collins at 3 o'clock to confirm the filing date. I will have you back by 2:30. She closed her satchel. "Then yes." They rode north on a bright October afternoon with the autumn light doing things to the red rocks that made the landscape look like a painting of itself, all warmth and deep shadow and gold. Grant led them up a canyon she had not surveyed, a narrow slot that opened suddenly into a hidden basin about a mile across, ringed by rock and full of blue grama grass that had not been grazed, fed by a spring that came out of the east wall and ran in a clear thread across the basin floor. Dorothy pulled Trouble to a stop and looked at it. "My grandfather found this in 1860, Grant said, coming up beside her. "He never registered it separately. It is inside the outer boundary of the ranch, so it never came up in the survey. But there is enough water here to support a home. A real home, not just a bunkhouse." He paused. I have been thinking about building here for 3 years. I have not started because building for yourself alone feels like a particular kind of sad exercise. Dorothy looked at the basin. The spring caught the light, the grass moved slowly in the wind, the rock walls were a deep, warm red. "It is beautiful," she said. "Yes," he said. He was not looking at the basin. She turned to look at him. He was watching her with the open, unhurried attention of a man who has already said the difficult thing and is now simply waiting for the world to arrange itself around what he has said. "Grant," she said. "Dorothy," he said, "I want to be honest with you about something. I would prefer that above anything else." She looked down at Trouble's gray mane for a moment, organizing her thoughts with the same careful precision she organized her survey data. "I have been alone for a long time. Not only in the sense of not having a partner, but in the deeper sense of having built a life that is deliberately self-contained, because self-containment is the only thing I have found that consistently fails to disappoint me." She looked back at him. "The idea of changing that frightens me more than Ridley with his hired men ever has, because land is land and disputes are disputes, and I know how to solve those. I do not always know how to solve people." "Neither do I," Grant said. "I have been very good at running a ranch and very poor at running toward anything that frightened me personally. I told myself it was patience. It was not patience. It was fear dressed up as patience." "What changed?" she asked. "You rode into this town," he said simply, "and I saw you look at Vera Clanton like she was a minor mathematical inconvenience, and I thought, there is a woman I would like to know. And then I got to know you, and it stopped being that simple and started being something I have not got a word large enough for." Dorothy looked at him for a long, still moment in the hidden basin with the spring running and the grass moving. Then she said, "I think what I am trying to tell you is that I want this. I want to see where this goes. I am saying it poorly because I am out of practice saying things I want rather than things I have concluded." "You are saying it perfectly," Grant said. He urged his horse close enough and she did not move Trouble away, and he reached across the space between them and took her hand, which was bare because she had taken her riding gloves off in the warm afternoon, and he held it with the care of a man holding something he cannot believe he is allowed to hold. They stayed in the basin until the sun moved and the shadow of the eastern wall began to cross the spring. And then she said she needed to get back for her appointment with Collins, and he said yes, and they rode back to town holding nothing because horses require two hands, but riding close enough that their stirrups occasionally touched. Collins confirmed the filing date as the 22nd of October, 1882. The survey would be entered into the territorial record, transmitted to the General Land Office in Washington, and would constitute the permanent legal boundary for every holding in the Harlan's Creek Valley. Dorothy signed the confirmation with her full name, which would appear on the official survey as the licensed surveyor of record. She stood outside the registry office in the late afternoon light and looked at the street of the town that had decided about her before she arrived, and felt the complex, unresolved satisfaction of a person who has done the work and proved the point through the only argument worth making, which is excellence. Vera Clanton passed her on the boardwalk. The woman stopped. For a moment it seemed like she might say something. Dorothy waited, not with hostility but with patience. "The railroad will do good things for the valley," Vera Clanton said, with the specific stiffness of a woman making the smallest possible concession. "It will," Dorothy agreed. Vera looked at her for another moment, then walked on. It was not an apology. Dorothy did not require one. She understood the difference between justice and satisfying endings, and she was old enough to take what the world offered and not waste energy demanding what it was unwilling to give. That evening, Grant had supper with her in the hotel dining room again, and this time they sat for 2 hours after the meal was done, talking about the kind of things that people talk about when they have stopped trying to be careful. She told him about her father, who had been an engineer and had died of cholera when she was 11, and how it was his books she had read after his death, the mathematics and the engineering and the physics, because they were how she stayed close to him. He told her about the winter of 1876 when the ranch had nearly failed, when he had been 25 and had run it alone after his father's first illness, and how he had driven the cattle to market in weather that his men had refused to ride in and had done it by himself across 3 mountain passes and had come back with just enough money to save the land. "Were you afraid?" she asked. "The whole time," he said. "I talked to my horse for 4 days straight. I have never told anyone that." "What did you tell him?" "Mostly that we were going to be fine. I do not know which of us I was trying to convince." She smiled. He had seen her smile before, but not quite like this, not with the particular quality of someone who has let their guard all the way down. It changed her face in a way that he felt in his chest like a physical thing. "I talked to Trouble," she admitted. "Extensively." "What do you tell him?" "I explained the survey calculations. He is a very good listener. He has never once tried to tell me I have done it wrong." Grant laughed, a full, genuine laugh, and Dorothy's smile widened, and the two of them sat in the nearly empty hotel dining room in Nevada in October 1882 and laughed together like people who have found something rare. The conversation that had been promised was happening. It continued for weeks. Dorothy did not leave Harlan's Creek immediately after the survey was filed. She had told herself she would stay only as long as the work required, but the work had a way of generating itself. Collins needed clarification on 3 of the secondary boundary descriptions. The railroad company's own surveyor came from San Francisco to verify her work, a man named Fletcher who was excellent and professional and who spent 2 days in the field with her, and at the end of those 2 days said, with obvious surprise and then obvious embarrassment at his own surprise, that her survey was the finest he had reviewed in the Western Territories. "Thank you," Dorothy said pleasantly. "I know." Fletcher blinked, recovered, and agreed to everything she had submitted. She also found, during those weeks, that she had begun to find reasons to be in the valley. The work created them at first, then the landscape did. She had begun making detailed topographic notes of the basin that she had seen with Grant, not officially, not under any commission, but because it was remarkable terrain, and remarkable terrain deserved to be properly documented. And Grant was there. Every day he was there in one capacity or another. He would find her in the mornings before she had had coffee, which was not always welcome, but which she could not quite bring herself to discourage. He would ride her to whatever section of the valley she was working in and then do his own work within a reasonable distance. They ate together most evenings. They talked every day. It was, Dorothy recognized with the analytical precision she applied to everything, a courtship. A careful, patient, frontier courtship conducted by 2 people who were both somewhat afraid and both absolutely unwilling to stop. On the 1st of November, Grant asked her if she would stay in Harlan's Creek, not as a question with conditions attached, but openly with all the risk visible. Not because of the survey, he said. They were at the spring in the basin, which she had taken to visiting in the late afternoons when the light on the rock walls was exactly right. Not because of any work, because I want you to be here and I want to know if you want that too. Dorothy looked at the spring. The water was very clear. "I have been offered a contract in Salt Lake City," she said. "The city needs a boundary survey for the new expansion district. It is significant work." "I know," he said. He had found out from Collins without meaning to and had said nothing, waiting for her to bring it to him in her own time. "It is good work." "It is," she agreed. She was quiet for a moment. "I have also been thinking," she said carefully, "about the possibilities of establishing an independent survey practice, based somewhere that has significant territorial growth, boundary disputes, land claims, railroad expansion. There is a great deal of work to be done in the Nevada Territory in the next decade." She paused. "Harlan's Creek is well positioned. It is a central location for the valley claims, and the railroad spur will bring connectivity that makes the city less necessary." He was very still. He had learned that this was her way of approaching things that mattered to her from the practical side first, the foundations before the feelings, because the feelings were real and she protected them by making sure the foundations were solid. All of that is true, he said. There is also, she said, still looking at the spring, the matter of what I told you in the dining room. About wanting to see where this goes. I remember, he said quietly. She turned to look at him. The afternoon light was full on her face, and it was a face he had memorized without trying to, the sharp intelligence of it and the particular way her mouth was shaped and the warmth in her dark eyes when she allowed herself to stop being careful. I have never done anything that frightened me as much as this, she said. I want you to know that. I know it, he said. I want you to know that I have never in my life wanted anything as much as I want you to stay. Dorothy Wainwright made 3 decisions in the next 30 seconds. She decided to decline the Salt Lake City contract. She decided to send a letter to Carson City outlining the basis for an independent survey practice in the Harlan's Creek area. And she decided to step forward and close the distance between herself and Grant Wells, which she did. And he put his arms around her and held her with the gentle strength of a man who understands what he is holding. And she let herself be held, which was perhaps the hardest and most important thing she had ever done. They stood by the spring in the hidden basin until the shadow of the east wall crossed them and the afternoon turned cool. And when they finally separated, she looked at him with the slightly dazed expression of someone who has just confirmed a hypothesis that they had been desperately hoping was correct. And he looked at her with something so open and full that she felt her throat tighten with it. "We should get back before dark," she said. "Yes," he said, not moving. "Grant." "Yes," he said, and they went back. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was the winter that the town of Harlan's Creek rearranged its understanding of Dorothy Wainwright. It happened not through a single dramatic reversal, but through the slow accumulation of ordinary days. Dorothy established her survey office in 2 rooms above the registry, which Mr. Abbott was deeply pleased about, and began taking local commissions. A homesteader needed his land claim verified for proof of title. The county needed its road boundaries documented for maintenance purposes. 2 neighbors had a fence dispute that she settled in an afternoon with her measuring chain and her notebook and her complete refusal to allow either party to be anything other than precisely correct. She was thorough. She was fast. She was cheaper than hiring a man from the county seat. She was right every time. Vera Clanton's husband, it turned out, had a boundary question on the north side of his property that had been bothering him for 6 years, and that had prevented him from building a barn in the location he wanted. He sent a message to Dorothy through the postmaster, which was as close to coming himself as his pride would allow. Dorothy went to the Clanton property on a Tuesday morning and spent 3 hours in the field, and came back and told Mr. Clanton that he could build his barn 10 yards closer to the north line than he had thought, and showed him the calculations. Vera Clanton, who had watched this from the porch, came down the steps as Dorothy was packing her equipment. "I will be direct with you," Vera said. "I would prefer that," Dorothy said. "I said something unforgivable to you on your first day in this town." "You said something cruel," Dorothy said. "Unforgivable is a theological concept that I will leave to others." Vera's chin trembled once and then steadied. "I made a judgment based on what I had been told without considering the source of the information or the purpose for which it had been spread. That was wrong of me." Dorothy looked at her steadily. "Yes," she said, "it was. I am sorry." Dorothy studied her for another moment, then nodded with the brisk precision she applied to all concluded matters. "Thank you for saying so. Your husband's barn site is yours to build on. I will file the documentation this week." She rode back to town. She did not make it easy, and she did not pretend it had not happened, but she accepted the apology because holding resentment was a weight she had been carrying for too long, and she was at the stage of her life where she was choosing carefully what to carry and what to set down. Grant, when she told him that evening, said, "How do you feel?" "Lighter," she said with some surprise. "I expected to feel nothing and I feel lighter." "That is what setting something down feels like," he said. She looked at him. Have you set many things down? I have been learning to, he said, looking at her in a way that made the comment mean more than its words. December brought cold that settled into the valley like something permanent, and the town drew itself inward and the nights were long. Dorothy discovered that the Wells Ranch house had a fireplace large enough to walk into, and that Grant cooked remarkable cornbread, and that the ranch bunkhouse held 3 longtime hands named Domingo, Calhoun, and Perkins, who had worked the Wells land for a combined 50 years, and who received Dorothy with the evaluative wariness of men, assessing a potential addition to something they care about. She won Domingo over on the 3rd visit by correctly identifying, from symptoms alone, that his horse had a thrush infection in the right front hoof and telling him exactly what treatment to apply. Domingo stared at her and then looked at Grant and then back at her. "Where did you learn horse medicine?" Domingo asked. "I grew up in Philadelphia," she said. "We had horses. My father believed that if you relied on something you should understand it." "She also surveys land better than anyone I have ever seen," Grant said. "I know," Domingo said. "She restaked my boundary markers last month and found that my property line was 6 feet further east than I had thought. I was losing water rights without knowing it." He looked at Dorothy. 6 feet further east means my creek access is secured." "The original stake had subsided over the years," Dorothy said. "The soil composition in that area does that in wet seasons. It is common." "Not common that anyone fixes it," Domingo said. He extended his hand. She shook it, which surprised him and pleased him simultaneously. Calhoun and Perkins came around by Christmas, which Dorothy spent at the ranch, the first time she had spent a holiday with other people in 4 years. It was not large or elaborate. It was cornbread and roasted beef, and dried apple pie that she and Grant made together in the kitchen with flour on his sleeve, and on her nose, and a fire in the enormous fireplace, and the sound of Domingo's guitar coming from the bunkhouse across the yard. And it was the finest Christmas she could remember. Grant gave her a new leather journal, the finest she had seen this side of the Mississippi, with her name tooled into the cover. She gave him a compass, a real precision compass from a scientific instrument maker in San Francisco, which she had ordered 3 weeks earlier and which had arrived on the new railroad spur with gratifying promptness. He turned it over in his hands and looked at her. "You remembered," he said. The broken compass he had been using when he was lost in the canyon, which had been the reason he had not been at the meeting when the town decided about Dorothy, had become part of their shared story in the way that small details become mythologized in the histories of people who are falling in love. "I remembered everything," she said. "I always do." He kissed her for the first time that evening in the kitchen, with the fire from the main room making the doorway warm and the night outside very cold and very quiet. It was not impulsive. They were both aware of every moment of it. She put her hand against his jaw where the stubble was, and he cupped her face with a gentleness that she had not known she was waiting for, and the kiss was long and careful, and everything that had been building between them since October arrived in it all at once. When it ended, she pressed her forehead against his and they stood very still. "I have been wanting to do that since the hotel lobby," he said. "The hotel lobby," she said. "Day one." "Day one," he confirmed. "It was the transit case," she said. "It was absolutely not the transit case." "It bumped your elbow," she said, with a smile against his cheek. "I noticed you before the case," he said firmly. "I noticed you the moment you came down the stairs. You looked at me like I was furniture. I looked at you like a man trying very hard not to look at a woman," he said, which was so accurate that she laughed outright, and the sound of her laughing in his kitchen on Christmas evening was the best thing he had heard in his entire life. The spring of 1883 opened the valley like an explanation, all green growth and running water in the creeks and the world looking like it had been cleaned. Dorothy's practice was established and growing. She had 3 employees by March. A young man named Averts who was learning transit work, a woman named Rosa who kept the office and correspondence, and who had, when Dorothy hired her, arrived with a copy of her arithmetic marks from the Harlan's Creek schoolhouse, and a determination that made Dorothy feel she had been looking in a mirror. And Mr. Abbott himself, who had officially retired from the registry, but who came in 3 mornings a week because, as he said, he had nothing else to do, and the filing system here was the best he had ever seen. The railroad spur brought changes to the valley: a new hotel, a land agency, 3 new businesses that had not existed before the spur, 200 new homestead filings in the surrounding area, each of which required survey work, each of which Dorothy's office handled with the precision that had made her reputation across the territory. Amos Ridley, whose false claim had been decisively disproved, and who had received none of the consequences he deserved, and all of the railroad prosperity he had tried to sabotage, left the valley in February on the grounds that he was moving to Arizona to be closer to family. No one tried to stop him. Dorothy did not celebrate his departure, because she did not believe in celebrating the absence of problems over the solving of them, but she did note it in her journal with a single dry sentence that she afterward read to Grant, who appreciated it enormously. Grant asked her to marry him on the 14th of April, 1883. He did not make a formal occasion of it or build to it with ceremony, because he had watched Dorothy long enough to know that she did not want ceremony for its own sake. He asked her in the basin, by the spring, where the blue grama grass was coming green after the winter, because that was their place and it always had been. He said, "I want to build a home here, and I want to build it with you, and I want to spend the rest of my life being the person you talk to when the work is done, if you will have me." Dorothy stood very still. She had known this was coming, in the way that a good surveyor knows a landmark is approaching because the terrain has been leading to it for miles. She had been deciding how she felt about it for weeks with the thoroughness she applied to all significant calculations. "There are things I need you to understand," she said, "about what a marriage to me would mean." "Tell me," he said. "My work is not optional," she said. "It is not something I do until I have children or until circumstances change. It is what I am, and I will not set it aside for any reason. I need that to be fully understood." "I understood that in October," he said. "I am not asking you to be anything other than what you are." "And I will not be managed," she said. "I will not have my opinions overridden or my decisions questioned without reason. I am a partner or I am nothing." "Dorothy," he said, with a patience that held no frustration in it at all, "you have described to the letter the woman I am asking to marry me. Those are not conditions. Those are the reasons I am asking." She looked at him in the April light. The spring ran behind her with its clear, consistent voice. The red walls were warm with the season. "Yes," she said, "I will marry you." He put his arms around her, and she held on with both hands, and they stood that way until the spring ran past them, and the grass moved around their feet, and the basin held them in its ring of warm red stone. They were married on the 6th of June, 1883, in the small church on the main street of Harlan's Creek, in a ceremony attended by what appeared to be the majority of the valley's population, which Dorothy found privately astonishing given the manner of her arrival 8 months earlier. Mr. Abbott cried, which he denied afterward. Domingo played his guitar. Rosa caught the bridal flowers, which she had not been trying to do but which came to her hands anyway. Vera Clanton attended, seated in the 4th row, wearing a very proper hat, and said nothing unkind, which was all Dorothy had ever wanted from her. The ceremony was presided over by the Reverend Crawford, who performed it with dignity and without condescension, which Dorothy had warned Grant she required before she would agree to have any religious official involved. Crawford, who had been briefed by Grant, performed the ceremony exactly as requested. Dorothy wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made in Carson City, with white at the collar, practical and elegant, the dress of a woman who understands that beauty and function are not opposites. She carried a small bundle of late spring wildflowers that Grant had gathered himself from the basin that morning. When the ceremony was concluded and they walked out into the June sun, Grant's hand warm around hers, the town of Harlan's Creek applauded, and Dorothy looked out at those faces, some of which had been hostile and some merely uncertain and some genuinely kind from the beginning, and she felt something that was not triumph and not vindication but something quieter and more permanent, a sense of having arrived, truly arrived, not just in this town but in her own life. They built the house in the basin that summer. It was not large by city standards, but it was well made, cedar framed with a stone foundation, 2 stories, a porch that wrapped the south side to catch the afternoon light, and a room on the east end with the best light in the building which Dorothy claimed as her office, and in which she put a long work table and her girly transit in its case on a shelf where it could be seen from anywhere in the room, and a bookshelf that was already half full and would be entirely full within a year. Grant added a spring room onto the kitchen that kept things cool using the basin's natural water flow, which Dorothy approved of as a solution that was elegant and required no technology that could break. The hands helped build. The neighbors brought food for the building days, which was the frontier custom, and in the tradition of the frontier, it did not much matter what someone had thought about you in October if you were building a house together in August, and the cornbread was good, and the work needed doing. By September, they were living in the basin house. The spring still ran past the east wall, and at night you could hear it if the windows were open, which Dorothy preferred even in the cold, because she had slept in cities for years and had missed the sound of the natural world without knowing she was missing it. She worked. She always worked. Her practice expanded into 3 counties by 1884. The territorial office retained her for 2 significant federal land surveys, one of which took her away from the valley for 6 weeks, during which time Grant wrote her letters that she kept in a box in her desk, and reread with a frequency she would not have admitted to anyone, including herself. She wrote back with equal frequency and considerably more eloquence, because she was a person who organized feelings into language as naturally as she organized territory into measurements. When she returned from the federal survey, he was waiting at the edge of the property with his horse, having ridden out to meet her on the road, which he had told himself he was not going to do and had done anyway. She rode up and he reached over and she took his hand, and they rode back to the basin together without saying anything at all, because everything that needed to be said was in the holding of hands on horseback in the September light in the valley that was theirs. In November of 1884, Dorothy told Grant that she was expecting. She told him in the kitchen in the morning, directly and without preamble, because she was Dorothy and she had no other mode. Grant set down his coffee cup with the careful deliberation of a man who is experiencing several large things simultaneously and is managing them by slowing down his physical movements. Then he looked at her across the kitchen. "Are you well?" he asked. It was the first thing, immediately and without hesitation, and she loved him entirely for it. "Very well," she said. "Tired in the mornings, otherwise perfectly functional." He came around the table and held her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression so full that it had no word large enough to contain it. She put her hands over his. "A baby," he said. "In the spring," she confirmed. "The spring of 1885 brought a son. They named him James, after Grant's father." James Wells arrived in the Basin house in April with a great deal of noise and very strong opinions about the arrangement, all of which Dorothy documented with the same methodical care she applied to everything, keeping a record of his progress in a journal that was entirely different from her professional notebooks, softer and fuller and written in a hand that looked less like technical notation and more like the correspondence of a woman who is deeply moved by something and has found a way to say so. She went back to work 6 weeks after James was born because she had a commission that could not wait and a client who had been patient, and an office that Rosa ran excellently, but that needed its director present. She brought James to the office 3 days a week in the first months, and he slept in a basket near her drafting table with a consistency that suggested he was already accustomed to the particular quiet of focused work. Grant took him on the other days, on horseback across the ranch, and James Wells grew up in the saddle and also in the survey office, and also in the Basin house with its spring sounds and its walls of books and its parents who worked hard at everything they did and argued respectfully and laughed often. By 1887, the practice had a full staff of 6 and Dorothy had been retained by the federal government to consult on the boundary survey for the pending Nevada statehood provisions, which was perhaps the most significant professional commission a surveyor in the territory could receive. The letter arrived on a Tuesday and she read it standing at her office window looking out over the valley, and then she sat down and read it again more slowly, and then she went home and told Grant. He read it. He looked up at her. "The federal government," he said. "It appears so," she said. He stood up and lifted her off the floor, which was not something he did often because she was not a person who invited being lifted off the floor. But on this occasion she laughed and put her arms around his neck and let him, and he held her up and she held on, and James, who was 2 and had been watching from the rug, applauded this event with the enthusiastic lack of context of the very young. Amos Ridley, they heard through the territorial grapevine in 1888, had died in Arizona of pneumonia. Dorothy noted this and said a brief sincere prayer for his soul, and then did not think about him again, which was more generosity than he had shown her. The man from Sacramento, whose name was Hargreaves, became relevant again in 1889 when he attempted to file for a federal survey contract in Nevada, and Dorothy's name appeared in the registry as the existing commissioned surveyor for the territory. He wrote a letter to the territorial office, suggesting that there were questions about her professional conduct. The territorial office, which by 1889 had 6 years of Dorothy Wainwright's impeccable survey work in its files, sent the letter back with a note explaining that they were satisfied with the qualifications and record of their existing surveyor. Dorothy was shown a copy of the letter by Collins, who had become a friend over the years, and she read it without any particular expression and then set it down. "Is that the end of it?" Collins asked. "Yes," she said, "that is the end of it." And it was. In 1890, they had a second child, a daughter they named Clara, who arrived in December and who was from her first week an entirely different person from James, quieter and more watchful, with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn patience. Clara would eventually show a pronounced aptitude for mathematics that delighted Dorothy and astonished Grant's ranch foreman, who discovered her doing long multiplication in the margins of a cattle ledger at the age of 6. James, by contrast, developed a passionate interest in horses and cattle and the physical management of the land, and spent his weekends following Grant across the ranch with the determination of a small person who has decided what he is going to be. Grant taught him everything he knew about reading grass and water and weather, and Dorothy taught him to read everything else, and James grew up at the intersection of those 2 kinds of knowledge and was the better for it. The Basin house expanded twice over the decade, once for a proper library room and once for a bigger kitchen, which had become necessary because Dorothy had discovered that she genuinely liked to cook when she was not rushing. And the kitchen was where the family gathered in the evenings, all 4 of them, around the big table with the lamp burning, and the spring running past the east wall, and the red rock basin holding the house in its warm, quiet circle. Grant and Dorothy sat on the south porch most evenings when the weather permitted. They had a habit, developed over years, of talking through whatever was occupying their minds: the work, the children, the valley, the larger questions of the world that came through the newspapers on the railroad. They disagreed sometimes, with the productive friction of 2 strong minds that have enough trust to be honest, and they agreed often enough that the disagreements were interesting rather than painful. In 1893, the Nevada Territorial Office commissioned a commemorative survey document recording the original boundaries of the state's primary land grants, a historical record that would be deposited in the State Library in Carson City and preserved in perpetuity. The project director was Dorothy Wainwright Wells, licensed surveyor. The acknowledgement page of the document described her as the foremost land surveyor in the Nevada Territory. She framed the acknowledgement page and hung it in her office next to the window. She looked at it occasionally, not with vanity, but with the particular quiet satisfaction of a person who has done the thing that was asked of them, and done it as well as it could be done. On a Sunday afternoon in the fall of 1893, Dorothy sat on the south porch of the Basin house watching James, who was 8, attempt to teach Clara, who was 3, to identify the different grasses in the basin by texture, which was going poorly because Clara was more interested in the creek. Grant came out with 2 cups of coffee and handed one to her and sat down beside her in the other chair, and they watched their children in the afternoon light. "Are you happy?" he asked. She looked at him with the slight surprise she still felt occasionally when someone offered her the direct question she had spent most of her early life not being asked. "Yes," she said, "genuinely and entirely." He looked out at the basin. "Do you miss Philadelphia?" "The library," she said. "I always miss the library, but I have made progress on that front." She gestured toward the interior of the house where the library room held by now 437 books. "And I have the land," she said, "which is better than the library." "You said the library was the best thing in Philadelphia." "I said I missed the library the most. The land is different from a library." She was quiet for a moment. "A library is what other people have known. The land is what is still being understood. I prefer what is still being understood." Grant looked at her. She was 43 years old, and the years had treated her with the particular honesty of an outdoor life. There were lines at the corners of her eyes and the first silver in her dark hair, and she was more beautiful than she had been in the hotel lobby in October of 1882 in a way that had nothing to do with the years and everything to do with what she had grown into. "You are remarkable," he said. She looked at him with the directness she had always had. "I know," she said, without false modesty. Then softer, "So are you." Clara had given up on grass identification and was now sitting in the shallow edge of the spring with her shoes off, which James was objecting to on the grounds that it was too cold. Grant watched them with the full, uncomplicated happiness of a man who has everything he chose and chose everything he has. He reached over and took Dorothy's hand. She turned it palm up and laced her fingers through his, the gesture easy and habitual and still warm after 10 years, and they sat together in the autumn light in the hidden basin, with the spring running and the grass moving, and the red walls holding the warmth of the day around them. The line between what the town of Harlan's Creek had decided about Dorothy Wainwright and the truth of who she was had been drawn as precisely as any boundary line she had ever marked in the desert floor, and she had been the one to draw it, and it had held. The compass Grant carried in his breast pocket, the one she had given him for Christmas in 1882 with its exact and reliable needle, had guided him home across the ranch in 3 storms and 2 dark nights, and had not once failed to point where it was supposed to point. Which is all a compass can do, and all she had long ago decided that anything really can, be accurate about its own nature and trust that the person holding it is worth guiding home. The spring ran past the house. The basin held its quiet. The family stayed.